Crimson Desert is a game that falls flat in many areas. It lacks proper execution, attention to detail, and was quite possibly one of the worst gaming experiences I've had in recent memory. It tries to be a jack of all trades, but is a master of none. The game starts us off with a chaotic introduction, which left me more confused than anything. You play as the main protagonist Cliff, who's the leader of the mercenary clan called the Greymanes. In the introduction, you face off against the Blackbears, who are the sworn enemies of the Greymanes, and end up fighting their leader, Myrden. During this battle, Cliff seemingly dies, along with some of his comrades, only to mysteriously reappear after the game's introduction ends. The very beginning of the game should have served me as a warning for what was to come, but I ignored it and kept pressing on, hoping that things would get better. Not only was the introduction confusing as all hell, but the actual introduction to the game's gameplay was even worse. It was a visual nightmare, and right offhand I had to switch the settings from graphics to performance because I was already having major frame rate issues. So much so that I actually replayed the opening sequence twice to see if I could make out what was going on the screen without the frame rate drops. I've seen reports of many gamers having the same issues, so needless to say, it wasn't a good start. I think that they have since fixed this issue with a patch of some sort, but still, when that's the first impression I get from your game, you're off to a really rocky start with me. After the opening sequence, Cliff is mysteriously revived and you start your journey off in Hernan, one of 5 major regions players get to explore on the vast continent of Pywell. After being brought back, the game very early on makes it obvious that Cliff's motivations are to find all his comrades and to restore his clan. Add a little extra motivation for vengeance, and you have yourself the basic ingredients to what could have been a great story. The problem is that the story never gets any clearer as you progress through the game. It starts off confusing and inevitably becomes even more confusing and more complicated than it ever really needed to be. It had terrible pacing, the main quest lines were bland as hell, and Cliff was as generic as they come. I don't recall ever being this disinterested in a character or their story in an RPG, but this is what happens when the story never really gets its footing. And when you combine that with a super generic protagonist like Cliff, you're doomed from the start. Other than the main premise, nothing else is conveyed in an interesting way. The narrative was all over the place and lacked direction. One minute I'm looking for clues on my comrades' whereabouts, and the next I'm solving a puzzle in the sky, conceivably to push the narrative forward. It's cool to want to add layers to a story, but it felt like there was nothing tying anything together. Instead, it felt like the developers focused more on trying to wow you with all the different technical aspects of the world, instead of really honing in on the game's main quests and story. It's a real shame too, because I really felt like this game had a lot of potential. As far as I could tell, besides just gathering up your comrades and restoring your clan, there seems to be a more imminent threat to the world. An impending doom type of threat. I didn't understand how or why the threat came to be, but I do know that it was a world-ending threat that Cliff and his other comrades needed to face together. There were also wars amongst the different factions in Pywell, with Myrden, the leader of the Blackbears that I mentioned earlier, in the middle of all of it. It was never clear to me what his motivation was, and as someone who was supposed to be one of the main antagonists in the game, it never really felt like there was a focus on him or the Blackbears. You would think that after dismembering your whole clan in the beginning of the game, there would be more of a concentrated effort to put his ruthlessness on full display, but that never really happens. And to me, that's because the game tries too hard to tie in a completely different type of plot. There was no clear direction, and some of the creative choices were questionable at best. Some parts of the narrative just felt completely out of place. Honestly, it all just felt like a mess from the start. Nothing, and I literally mean nothing, was memorable or impactful about the story in any way. They certainly tried to get you to care in some aspects, but with the story being such a mess from the beginning, it was hard for me to really stay interested. Now, Cliff wasn't the only one that came across as a generic character. The other side characters were also just as generic and as boring as Cliff was. Prilibus did try really hard to get us to like them though, but the character development was just not there for me. Sure, a lot of the side characters had plenty of screen time with plenty of cutscenes, but that just wasn't enough. The characters were simply not integrated well into any of the main missions. There are other games in this space that do a better job at this. Take Final Fantasy VII for example. In that game, you have the ability to play through the missions with your main characters and the side characters as well. This gave you, as the gamer, the chance to get more attached to your characters and hear interesting dialogue between your main protagonist and some of the other characters around him. In Final Fantasy VII, the side characters were just as part of the plot as any. But in Crimson Desert, other than appearing in cutscenes and a few individual missions here and there, I don't recall them ever really being part of any major missions, and if they were, their impact was pretty minimal. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use the same type of formula that was used in Final Fantasy, but if Cliff had such a strong connection to his Greymane family, and if his main motivation was to restore them to their former glory, I think it would have made a little bit more sense to include more missions that highlighted their relationship with one another. Even when things started to ramp up in the game, there weren't any memorable missions where you got to see the full might of the legendary clan. Instead, the game opts out of that and allows you to play as two of the side characters, Unka and Damien, sort of like in GTA 5. Unka being the heavy hitter of the clan and Damien being more like an assassin-like character. None of those characters were any more interesting to me, so there wasn't any real incentive to play as them. Plus, other than a couple of instances, the game never really forces you to play as them anyway, so it's really a matter of choice whether or not you want to do some of the side stuff with them. To be fair, I get what it was that they were going for, but in order to have this type of system work, where you play as separate side characters individually, you need to create enough missions for all three characters and find a way to make it all as cohesive as possible. Here it just feels like it was just something else that they slapped into the game just for the sake of it. A clear example of the game trying to do too much with poor execution. And that's not the only thing either. There are plenty of examples where it's evident that the game tried to implement similar features that are found in other games already. Take the honor system for example. It's pretty clear that the game drew inspiration from other games like Red Dead, Fallout, and even Infamous. But the difference between those games and this game is that in those other games, the honor system actually served a purpose and impacts each respective game drastically. The story, the character development, the gameplay are all things affected by the choices you make, but in Crimson Desert, it means absolutely nothing as far as I could tell. It doesn't affect the narrative, doesn't affect the skills that you unlock, it doesn't affect dialogue, and it barely affects how NPCs react when they see you. It's quite literally one of the dumbest, most insignificant systems in the game, and if you're going to make such a piss poor attempt at something that's supposed to be meaningful, you might as well not even include it in the game. If you commit some sort of crime, a giant red circle appears, and in order to escape, all you have to do is leave the red circle. You will accrue a fine, sure, but that fine never really has to be paid, and no one ever comes after you. NPCs treat you again as if nothing really happened, and you get flagged for some of the dumbest things. I remember constantly pressing square to try to talk to an NPC and accidentally stealing something, which would then trigger the honor system and force me to have to make a quick escape out of that stupid red circle that appears. It's unrewarding and it feels like it doesn't belong. The bank system is something else that was poorly implemented. This is supposed to be where players get great returns from their investments, but it's completely broken with some reports of negative returns and infinite refresh loops. From your camp, you can send some of your comrades out on different missions like in Assassin's Creed's Brotherhood, but you need specific currency in order to do it, and everything is just really poorly explained. Ultimately, this is yet another feature that just feels unrewarding, but at least makes sense to have. I mean, I understand why they put it in the game. I just wish they would have simplified it some and made it a more integral part of the game overall. But perhaps the most egregious of all the in-game features has got to be the fort liberations. Guys, we've all played video games where you have to go to an outpost and fight a bunch of enemies in order to liberate the occupied area. In fact, I consider this a staple in most open world games. It's a chance for the game to showcase its combat, its enemy variety, and a chance for the player to really hone in on their skills. It's something that's damn near impossible to get wrong, but yet somehow, someway, they did. Now, unlike my gripes with some other games in the past where the world has too many of these forts to clear, in this game, the forts are quite literally oversaturated with enemies. Like, it's actually quite absurd how many enemies you are forced to fight at once. Like, to the point where it feels broken. It works like this. You get to a fort or an outpost and a little bar appears on the left hand side of your screen. The goal is to get it from 100% to 0. Pretty simple, right? Except that you're literally faced with a ridiculous amount of enemies at once. You don't believe me? Well, watch this and see for yourself.
Die already, you shag. So eager to die in a fight already lost.
Not only is the quantity of enemies ridiculous, but the enemy AI is horrendous. All you have to do is spam R1 and R2 if you're playing on a PS5 like me, and you'll be able to slaughter most of them, not because of your own skill, but because the enemy AI is that bad. All they do is swarm you and try to overwhelm you with numbers. They just recklessly jump in and the rest follow like sheep being led to the slaughter. I know I might catch some heat for this, but I truly didn't like the combat in this game. I've seen a lot of different forums and videos saying that this game's combat is excellent, but to me, it had no real depth to it, and a lot of it had to do with the terrible enemy AI. Now, even if I'm critical, I'm always going to be fair, so let me applaud the game developers for a modest attempt at giving us good combat gameplay. It wasn't all bad. There were some genuine moments where the game impressed me with some combat sequences. There were times where I kind of just entered a flow state of sorts, and where I genuinely enjoyed cutting my way through countless of enemies like an overpowered tank with swords. But that feeling was short-lived because the combat got repetitive all too quickly. Encountering pockets of enemies on the way to an objective was cool for a while, but when the game throws an absurd amount of enemies your way over and over and over again, the combat can get old pretty quick. Add the fact that there was no real strategy when facing these enemies, and not only does the combat get old all too quickly, but it starts to feel like a mind-numbing chore. Again, kudos to Prolibus for at least trying. I mean, they did give you a skill tree with different types of skills to focus on. The 3 different skill paths to focus on were health, stamina, and spirit. In order to unlock skills in one of these paths, you needed to find different Abyss artifacts spread throughout the world by completing different missions, sending comrades on faction quests, defeating enemies, and the most annoying of them all, completing puzzles. More on those later though. Some of the skills were decent, but others I found no use for. I had mixed feelings on the skills they made available to you in this game because to me it just felt like too much. I'm all for variety when it comes to combat, but only when it makes sense. To me, they just took the combat a little too far with some of these skills. There were some skills that I unlocked that I even forgot I had and that just felt unnecessary. To me, a more concise skill tree in this game would have made more sense. It would have made the combat more engaging and less cheesy. With how overpowered your character was, it was hard to take any of the enemies seriously anyway. That and the fact that again, there was little enemy variety. I approached each battle the same way and got away with it for pretty much the whole game. I bought lots of food to replenish my health during battle and just spammed the same buttons over and over again. There wasn't a single time where I used any potions or tools or anything of the sort. Even with some of the harder enemies, all you had to do was stagger them and it was pretty much a done deal after that. Other than the occasional captains, forts were pretty easy to take over, especially when you realize that you could take down some enemy structures within the fort to reduce the number of enemies you had to fight. My biggest gripe with this feature is that even if the game gives you this as an option, it was ambiguous with its instructions, and at first you really didn't know what it was that they were telling you to destroy. Plus, even when the structures were destroyed, you still had a crazy number of enemies to plow through. Speaking of enemies, I also applaud Prolibus for giving us plenty of bosses to fight. To me, it just kind of felt like most of the bosses were underwhelming, especially in the later half of the game. Other than a few, most of the bosses in this game aren't really memorable or fun even. Beating them didn't feel any more rewarding than fighting the more common enemies throughout the game. Some looked cool, appearance-wise, but that's about it. Attack patterns at times didn't make sense, and sometimes you were forced to fight these bosses in some ridiculously confined spaces. And to make matters worse, there were times where my game would just crash out of nowhere while facing some of these bosses. And even worse than that, all of the bosses felt similar to me. Each boss that I encountered had very similar pacing, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but when your combat is already coming up short in other areas, you start expecting something different. Maybe different pacing to the boss fights would have forced players to come up with different approaches. And although the game gave you plenty of skills and ways to kill enemies, during my playthrough, it never felt like those skills were really necessary for you to get the job done. Now, moving on from the combat, let's talk about the world of Crimson Desert. To me, this is another area where the developers just fell flat. Now, you do get some pretty cool visuals at certain points. You know, there were different regions, weather cycles, and cool environments to explore. The graphics weren't the sharpest at times, but I will admit that I was a fan of the setting itself. I'm a sucker for medieval lore and truly enjoy the fantasy aspect of these types of games. The problem wasn't the world itself, but more so the lack of attention to detail within the world. Like I just previously mentioned, the graphics weren't the sharpest at times, but besides that, what really ruined the immersion for me were the physics. They just felt off throughout my whole playthrough. The climbing mechanics felt lazy to me, with your stamina constantly depleting too quickly. Horse mechanics felt stiff to me, and overall, the physics of the game felt clumsy. This was the most apparent when facing hordes of enemies. The animations after killing enemies or blasting some of them away were laughable at times. The environmental destruction also didn't feel realistic and lacked that extra weightiness that you usually feel in other games. Overall, the physics really ruined the immersion. Again, these are small details that, in the grand scheme of things, could have made the game that much better. And when your game is falling flat in other areas, it's imperative that you get them right. And call me crazy, but the different village settlements spread throughout the world weren't all that interesting to me. There was nothing really memorable about them. Nothing that stood out. Blacksmiths, armors, and tailors all reacted the same way to you, and were pretty basic. I don't recall them offering anything special enough that made me care about going back to see them specifically. What you could do at these sites as you progress through the game is enhance your weapons through what the game calls refinement. I thought this was a pretty cool system. When you have the right materials, refining your weapons could boost its stats, make them stronger for your next enemy encounter. You can also do some more basic stuff like sell items that you find along the way and break down certain materials for other materials that you might need. You know, the typical stuff you'd expect from an RPG. The main issue that I have with it is that none of the weapons that I was exposed to throughout my playthrough ever really wowed me. Quite the opposite really, with pretty much each category of weapon feeling the same. One spear would feel the exact same way to me as another spear, just with higher stats maybe. Great swords for the most part felt the same as well, and regular swords were cool and okay to use for a while, but again, kind of all played the same. Throughout my playthrough, nothing ever felt special about any of the weapons I was using. I was attached to nothing, and the game never really put me in a position to where I needed to use anything in particular. Nothing felt unique, is what I'm trying to say. Normally, when I earn a weapon in another game, I'm excited to use it, but in this one, I hardly ever even noticed when I got a new weapon, unless I was intentionally cycling through my weapons. Now remember guys, I'm only talking to you guys about my experience. I've seen some videos out there of people using plenty of weapons that I didn't discover myself, that have some cool abilities, but since I never discovered them myself, I can only tell you about the ones that I did discover and how they made me feel. Same goes for the armor. I never ended up finding any crazy cool armor. And that being said, a lot of that could have been me. I mean, I can't remember when it happened, but there was a point in the game where I just decided that I needed to plow through and finish. The faction quests, the exploration, and the extra stuff you could do on the side was just not worth it to me anymore. The immersion, or lack thereof, just made me want to get through the game. So maybe if I would have hung in there just a bit more, I could have discovered some really cool weapons and armor. At the same time, I did put almost 100 hours into the game. And if in that time you couldn't award me with something unique enough to impress me, then maybe it wasn't me and it was just the game's progression system. That's another thing. Besides the skills that you get to unlock, progression in this game sucked. It felt like it was non-existent. Sure, I may have not completed all 350 plus quests, but I still completed around 100 or so, and all I got was a lot of dialogue and stuff that I never really had a use for. I got rewarded with faction experience, and throughout my playthrough I had no idea what the point of that was. I got gear that I rarely ever used, elixirs that were useless to me, and crafting material which I never used because I got to the point where I just didn't care anymore. Just to put it into perspective guys, I played close to or over 100 hours and did 80 plus faction quests, and I still feel this way. So again, maybe a lot of it was on me, or maybe it was just the game. Before we wrap this thing up guys, it's important for me to get this final point across, and it has to do with something that I mentioned earlier. This game has the worst, and I do mean quite literally, the worst puzzles I have ever seen in any game. I thought that Immortals of Avium had some ridiculously hard puzzles at times, but this game takes it to a whole nother level. Not only do they ruin any little semblance of immersion that you might feel while playing, but they are so cryptic and difficult to figure out that it throws the whole pacing of the game off. Not that it had good pacing to begin with, but it literally felt like Pearl Abyss did this intentionally, just to pad more hours of gameplay into the game. I never played a game where for 90% of the puzzles, I had to have YouTube up at all times. Normally, puzzles in video games are supposed to be intuitive, but these feel unnecessarily hard with unclear direction. Terrible, just terrible. But if that didn't make it clear enough that they wanted to just pad more hours into the game for the sake of it, allow me to tell you guys about Blackstar, the dragon map that you receive at the end of the game in order to finish the game's story. Just a warning, this section will be filled with spoilers, and if you don't want any spoilers, I've left a timestamp in the description of the video so you can skip to the final verdict. Blackstar is a dragon mount that the game gives you in the final parts of this game. I just want to make it clear that when I initially saw that we were going to get a dragon and that we were going to be able to use a dragon, I immediately thought, this is gonna be awesome. I was completely wrong. If for whatever reason you fail the mission or restart it, your Dragon Mount has a cooldown window of 70 minutes real time. And what really makes things worse is that you need your Dragon Mount to complete the mission. There is no checkpoint that puts you right back where you were. The Dragon Mount is the only one that can get you to this stupid ass fortress in the sky where you have to fight one of the worst endgame bosses ever. So for 70 minutes I was forced to roam the world and kill time while my mount cooldown reset so that I can complete this mission. Who the hell at Pearl Abyss thought that this was a good idea? Why would you even put this in a game if not to pad more hours into an already terrible experience? And it's not like using the dragon was all that fun. The controls were finicky and you only needed him for like 4 minutes. It was incredibly underwhelming. The only way around this was to get some horn of some sort, but by the time it would have taken me to figure out how to get this horn, it would have taken me more time than just waiting around. So I chose the latter, of course. I was so pissed off when I realized I had to wait 70 minutes, real time, not in-game time, 70 minutes real world time just for my Dragon Mount to cool down so that I can complete the final portions of this game. It was incredibly frustrating and blatantly obvious that all they cared about was padding more hours into their game. By this point in the game, I was pretty certain that it couldn't get any worse. Hell, I already had an idea of how I was going to score the game. But yet again, Pearl Abyss found a way to shoot themselves in the foot. I have played and beaten a lot of video games in my lifetime, and amongst all of the games I have beaten, I seriously think that Crimson Desert has one of the worst endings that I have ever played in any video game. Confusing is an understatement. I quite literally had no idea what the hell was going on. It was anticlimactic and overall just a weak ending. First of all, everything that they throw at you is absurd. And it all starts with that stupid ass flying fortress that I mentioned earlier. You know, the one that I needed Black Star, the Dragon Mount, to get to. From that point on, the game puts you through a gauntlet that it never quite prepares you for. Boss fight after boss fight after boss fight after boss fight. And then one really annoying and unnecessary long sky puzzle leads you to the end of the game where you face another multi-phased boss battle. The one that you think is supposed to be the main enemy. But no, after beating that boss, the game gives you another multi-phased boss. And when you're done beating that boss, guess what? The game gives you the real final boss, which was shit on a platter. I was so pissed after I finished the game that I changed my score immediately. The boss fights in the end, with the exception of maybe one, were just horrible. Does this look like a compelling boss fight to you? Nothing about the ending made any sense or gave the game any sort of closure. Everything felt clunky, and the shock value that they were going for just didn't work. By this point in time, you guys are probably tired of hearing me talk about this game, so let me sum it up for you. Crimson Desert sucks, guys. It had performance issues. The physics were off-putting. Controls felt clunky, the narrative was confusing as all hell, and the characters were all generic and underwhelming. The enemy AI was terrible. The bosses sucked overall. The puzzles were awful, and the pacing was off. The ending felt forced and felt like they threw way too much at you just for the sake of it. And the final boss, you know, the true final boss, was shit. The game didn't feel rewarding, and a lot of the features that were included in this game are in other games already, but done better. As an RPG, it fails. As an open world, it fails. And none of the main quests or side quests were interesting to me. For those reasons, Crimson Desert gets a 4 out of 10. I was gonna give it a 5. But the ending plus the cooldown window for the Dragon Mount really was the nail in the coffin for me. It's a below average experience that does not warrant a $70 price tag. It's a memorable game, sure, but memorable for the wrong reasons. don't buy this game unless you feel like wasting time, and if you're gonna buy it on sale just to see how bad it is. You'll have more fun knowing that you didn't pay full price like I did. Well, there you guys have it. I know this was a long one, but thank you guys for tuning in. Sorry this one took me a while to put out. Besides the game itself being super long, I've had a lot of personal things going on. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the review though. Now I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys think about the game? Was I too harsh? Do you guys agree with me, or do you think this game is as great as some say it is? Leave your comments down below, and as always, be on the lookout for another video from your boy, Makina. Peace.